Guns, Germs, and Steel. The Fates of Human Societies. By Jared Diamond. Prologue. Yali's question. We all know that history has unfolded very differently for peoples in different parts of the world. In the roughly 13,000 years since the last ice age ended, some societies built literate industrial civilizations with metal tools, others developed only farming villages without writing, and still others remained hunter-gatherers using stone tools. Those inequalities cast long shadows, because the literate societies with steel and guns went on to conquer, displace, or exterminate the others. This book sets out to explain why, and its answer is captured in a single sentence. History followed different courses for different peoples because of differences in their environments, not because of any biological differences among the peoples themselves. The question that drives the whole book was put to Jared Diamond in July of 1972, on a beach in New Guinea, where he was working as a biologist studying bird evolution. A charismatic local politician named Yali, walking the same road, fell into conversation with him. Yali had never been outside New Guinea and had not been educated beyond high school, but his curiosity was relentless. 2 centuries earlier, all New Guineans had still been living in the Stone Age. Then white colonists arrived, imposed government, and brought a flood of material goods, steel axes, matches, medicines, clothing, soft drinks, umbrellas, which New Guineans collectively called cargo. After quizzing Diamond for a long while, Yali finally asked the question that would take 25 years to answer. Why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own? Diamond had no answer at the time, and neither did professional historians. Yet the question is neither offensive nor trivial. Pushed back a step, it becomes, why? By the year 1500, when Europe's overseas expansion was just beginning, did peoples on different continents already differ so enormously in technology and political organization? Metal-equipped empires ruled much of Eurasia. 2 American peoples, the Aztecs and Incas, ruled empires with stone tools, and most of the rest of humanity lived as farming tribes or hunter-gatherer bands. Push back further, to 11,000 years before the Common Era, and all peoples everywhere were still hunter-gatherers. So the real question becomes, why did human development proceed at such wildly different rates on different continents? That question is history's broadest pattern, and it is this book's subject. Diamond confronts the ugliest possible answer head-on. Many people, openly or privately, assume the differences reflect innate differences in intelligence between peoples. He rejects this flatly, and not only because it is loathsome, but because it is wrong. From 33 years of working alongside New Guineans, he argues that, if anything, traditional New Guineans are on average more intelligent, more alert, and more curious than the average Westerner, sharpened by a life in which survival depends on wits rather than on immunity to crowd diseases, and unburdened by the passive stupefaction of television, which in the average American household runs for 7 hours a day. The usual racist assumption, he says, has to be turned on its head. Other easy answers fail just as badly. It is not the bracing cold of northern climates, since Northern Europe contributed nothing fundamental to civilization until the last 1,000 years, and simply had the good luck to receive advances developed in warmer regions. It is not the fertility of great river valleys, since complex irrigation followed centralized states rather than causing them. And it is not enough to list the immediate weapons of conquest, guns, germs, steel, and ships, because that only pushes the question back. Why did Europeans, rather than Africans or Native Americans, end up with those weapons in the first place? The lopsided results of history, that it was not 51% of the Americas conquered by Europeans and 49% of Europe conquered by Native Americans, demand deep and inexorable explanations. And so long as no convincing explanation is offered, people will keep quietly suspecting the racist one. That, Diamond says, is the strongest reason to write the book. The genuine explanation lies not in the people, but in the land beneath their feet, in geography, in biology, in the accidental distribution across the planet of the plants and animals worth domesticating. World history, one reviewer said, is like an onion whose modern surface must be peeled back layer by layer. The peeling is what this book attempts. Chapter 1. Up to the starting line. To compare the continents fairly, we need a starting line, and Diamond sets it at around 11,000 years before the Common Era, the end of the last ice age, the first undisputed peopling of the Americas, and the eve of farming. The tour begins 7 million years ago in Africa, where a population of apes split into the lines leading to gorillas, chimpanzees, and ourselves. Our ancestors walked upright by 4 million years ago and began enlarging their brains around 2.5 million years ago, passing through the stages we call Australopithecus, Homo habilis, and Homo erectus. Homo erectus was the first to leave Africa, reaching Java perhaps as long as 1.8 million years ago. For most of that vast span, tools barely changed. Even 500,000 years ago, when African and European skulls had grown round enough to be called Homo sapiens, and even among the Neanderthals of Europe, who had brains slightly larger than ours and were the first to bury their dead, the stone tools remained crude, without standardized shapes. Then, around 50,000 years ago, came what Diamond calls the Great Leap Forward. Suddenly there were standardized tools of bone shaped into needles and fishhooks, multi-piece weapons like harpoons and bows and arrows, jewelry of ostrich shell beads, sewn clothing, and the magnificent cave paintings of Lascaux. Whatever triggered it, perhaps the perfection of the modern voice box and language, human creativity had switched on. This leap coincided with humanity's first great expansion into new lands, and each expansion carried a dark signature. The colonization of Australia and New Guinea, joined then into a single continent, required crossing at least 8 sea channels and demands the earliest known use of watercraft, by around 40,000 years ago. Soon after humans arrived, Australia's spectacular megafauna, giant kangaroos, a cow-sized marsupial called a diprotodont, a 1-ton lizard, vanished, almost certainly killed off or burned out by the newcomers. The same pattern repeated in the Americas. Humans crossed from Siberia into Alaska by around 12,000 years before the Common Era. The Clovis hunters, named for their distinctive spear points found near Clovis, New Mexico, spread explosively and reached Patagonia within 1,000 years. And within a century or two of their arrival, most of America's big mammals, its native horses, camels, and giant ground sloths, went extinct around 11,000 years before the Common Era. Some of them, like the Shasta ground sloth of the Grand Canyon, dated to within a century of the hunter's appearance. Those extinctions mattered enormously, because they stripped Australia and the Americas of the very animals that might later have been domesticated. An imaginary archaeologist touring the world at that starting line could not have predicted which continent would race ahead. But the animals were already, silently, being dealt out unevenly. Chapter 2. A Natural Experiment of History. Before examining 13,000 years across whole continents, Diamond offers a smaller, faster experiment that lets us watch environment shape society in real time. The settlement of Polynesia. Around 1,200 years before the Common Era, a single seafaring people spread out from near New Guinea and, over the following centuries, colonized nearly every habitable island in the Pacific. Because they all sprang from one ancestral culture, with the same language, tools, crops, and animals, the different fates of their island societies can be traced almost entirely to the different islands themselves. The grimmest illustration is the Chatham Islands, 500 miles east of New Zealand. There, one group of these Polynesians, the Moriori, had reverted to being peaceful hunter-gatherers on cold islands too chilly for their tropical crops, capping their small population by renouncing war. Meanwhile, on warmer New Zealand, their cousins the Maori had become dense populations of farmers locked in ferocious chronic warfare. In December of 1835, when a shipload of Maori learned of the gentle, unwarlike Moriori, they sailed over, announced the Moriori were now their slaves, and slaughtered and enslaved them. Same ancestors, less than a millennium apart. Opposite environments produced opposite societies, and sealed the outcome when they finally collided. Across all of Polynesia, 6 environmental variables, island climate, geological type, marine resources, area, terrain fragmentation, and isolation, produced an astonishing range of societies from one starting point. Population densities ran from just 5 people per square mile among the Chatham hunter-gatherers to over 1,100 per square mile on tiny Enuta, denser than modern Holland. On the rich, wet islands of Hawaii, Irrigated taro fields yielded up to 24 tons per acre and supported chiefs, priests, bureaucrats, and 8 ranked lineages of nobility. The Easter Islanders, with only 7,000 people and no power but their own muscles, erected 30-ton stone statues. Tonga became a genuine maritime empire, its navies of great canoes each carrying up to 150 men, conquering islands 500 miles away. Polynesia is only a small slice of the world's diversity, but it proves that environment alone can diversify one people into everything from egalitarian bands to proto-empires. The question is whether the same thing happened on the continents, and why. Chapter 3. Collision at Cajamarca. The most dramatic collision in modern history took place on the 16th of November, 1532, in the Peruvian highland town of Cajamarca. There, Francisco Pizarro, leading just 168 ragged Spaniards, captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, absolute ruler of the largest and most advanced state in the Americas, in the middle of his own empire, surrounded by an army of 80,000 men. Within minutes of first setting eyes on each other, Pizarro's men had seized the emperor and were cutting his unarmed retinue to pieces, killing perhaps 7,000 Incas while losing not a single Spaniard. Pizarro then held Atahualpa for 8 months, extracting history's largest ransom, a room 22 feet long, 17 feet wide, filled with gold to a height of over 8 feet, and then executed him anyway. What unfolded that day survives in vivid detail, because 6 of Pizarro's companions, including his brothers, wrote it down. The Spaniards spent the night before in terror, keeping watch over the Inca campfires spread across the hillside, so close to each other that it looked like the sky brightly studded with stars. When Atahualpa finally entered the plaza on his silver-trimmed litter, borne by 80 lords in rich blue livery, so many Spaniards, hidden and waiting, urinated without noticing it, out of sheer terror. Then, at Pizarro's signal, the guns and trumpets sounded, the armored cavalry burst out, and the slaughter of the unarmed, crowded Indians began. How could this happen? Diamond traces the chain of proximate causes, and they are precisely the factors named in the book's title, plus a few more. Consider the raw odds: 168 Spaniards, 62 horsemen, and 106 foot soldiers, crushed an army 500 times more numerous. In the battles that followed, on the march to Cuzco, a mere 80, 30, 110, and 40 Spanish horsemen routed tens of thousands of Incas each time. First, weapons and armor of steel. The Spaniards' swords, lances, and daggers slaughtered thinly protected Indians, while their steel helmets turned aside the blows of blunt Inca clubs. Second, horses, whose shock and speed left foot soldiers helpless in the open, a military weapon that would dominate warfare for 6,000 years, until the First World War. Even after the Incas learned to ambush cavalry in mountain passes, they could never defeat horsemen on open ground. Guns played only a minor, mainly psychological role. Pizarro had barely a dozen clumsy harquebuses. But the power of firearms against peoples who lacked them would only grow. In 1808, a single musket-armed sailor named Charlie Savage paddled up to a Fijian village and fired into the undefended crowd until the survivors sheltered behind the piled bodies of the dead, and the stream ran red. Third, and most decisive of all, germs. Atahualpa was at Cajamarca in the first place only because a smallpox epidemic, spreading overland ahead of the Spaniards themselves, had killed the previous emperor and his heir around 1526, plunging the empire into a civil war between Atahualpa and his half-brother that Pizarro exploited. Throughout the Americas, Eurasian diseases raced ahead of the conquerors and killed an estimated 95% of the native population. Fourth, centralized political organization and maritime technology built and financed the ships that carried Pizarro across the ocean, and the Inca's own centralized structure became a fatal weakness once its godlike monarch was seized. Finally, writing. The Spaniards were heirs to a vast written record of human behavior and history. Pizarro explicitly modeled his ambush on Cortez's earlier trap for the Aztec Emperor Montezuma. Atahualpa, by contrast, had no written knowledge of the Spaniards, no experience of overseas invaders, and walked into the trap because he could not imagine it. But all of these are only proximate causes. The deeper question remains: why did the Spaniards have the guns, the germs, the steel, the ships, and the writing, rather than the Incas? That is the work of the rest of the book. Chapter 4. Farmer Power. Every one of those advantages, the germs, the steel, the writing, the ships, the political states, traces back to one ultimate cause: food production. Diamond opens with a memory from his teenage summer of 1956, working on a Montana farm alongside a gentle, well-spoken Blackfoot Indian named Levi, whose tribe of famous warriors had been dispossessed by immigrant white farmers. How did the farmers beat the warriors? The answer is that farming does not make one person stronger. It makes societies denser, richer, and more organized. The first link is the most direct. By growing the few species we can eat until they make up 90% rather than a tiny fraction of the living matter on a patch of land, farmers extract 10 to 100 times more calories per acre than hunter-gatherers. More calories mean more people. Domestic animals multiply the advantage in 4 ways: meat, milk, fertilizer, and the pulling of plows. A farmer's fixed home also shortens the interval between births. Hunter-gatherer mothers, who must carry their children on the move, space births about 4 years apart, while settled farmers can manage roughly 2. Denser populations of farmers simply overwhelm sparser bands of hunters by sheer numbers. But the deeper consequence is that stored food surpluses feed people who do not grow food. A settled society that can stockpile grain can support full-time specialists, kings and bureaucrats who tax and govern, professional soldiers, who in the end wore down New Zealand's brave but part-time Maori warriors with 18,000 full-time British troops, priests to bless the wars, and craftsmen and scribes who develop weapons, technologies, and records. Big animals also transform transport and war. Before domestication, the only way to move heavy goods overland was on human backs. The horse, donkey, camel, and llama changed that forever. Horses became the tanks and jeeps of ancient warfare. Domesticated around 4,000 years before the Common Era in the steppes north of the Black Sea, they carried the westward spread of Indo-European languages. Let the Hyksos conquer horseless Egypt around 1674 before the Common Era, powered the battle chariots invented around 1800, and, after saddle and stirrup, carried the Huns and finally the Mongols across Asia and Europe, dominating war until trucks and tanks replaced them in the First World War. And the crowd diseases that evolved from domestic animals became a biological weapon that killed up to 99% of previously unexposed peoples. Food production, in short, was the seed from which guns, germs, and steel all grew. Chapter 5. History's haves and have-nots. If food production was so powerful, the puzzle is why it arose in only a few places and so unevenly. Food production began independently in no more than 9 areas of the world, and confidently in only 5. Southwest Asia, the Fertile Crescent, with the earliest firm dates, around 8,500 years before the Common Era. China, nearly as early. Mesoamerica, the Andes, and the eastern United States, a full 6,000 years later than the Fertile Crescent. For more are candidates, including New Guinea, the Sahel, tropical West Africa, and Ethiopia, which gave the world coffee. What is striking is where farming did not arise on its own. Some of today's richest farmlands, California, the Argentine Pampas, temperate Australia, much of Western Europe, and the Cape of South Africa, never developed indigenous agriculture at all, and their peoples were still hunter-gatherers when Europeans arrived. Meanwhile, the earliest farming centers, like Iraq, Iran, and Mexico, look today like rather marginal, dry, or degraded land. The explanation, as we will see, has nothing to do with the cleverness of the local people and everything to do with the wild plants and animals that happen to grow nearby. From these few centers, food production spread outward, sometimes carried by ideas and crops adopted by local hunter-gatherers, as in Egypt and the American Southwest, and sometimes carried by invading farmers who displaced or replaced the original inhabitants, as in the great Austronesian and Bantu expansions we will meet later. Those with the head start on food production got the head start on the road to guns, germs, and steel. Chapter 6. To farm or not to farm. Why did anyone take up farming at all, when the earliest farmers were often smaller, sicker, and shorter-lived than the hunter-gatherers they replaced? The key insight is that no one ever chose farming. The first farmers could not have been striving toward agriculture as a goal. because they had never seen it. Food production evolved as an accidental byproduct of thousands of small, unconscious decisions about how to spend a day's time and effort. Several forces gradually tipped the balance. Wild game grew scarcer as the great mammals went extinct and human hunters multiplied, making hunting less rewarding. At the same time, climate change at the end of the Ice Age expanded the stands of wild cereals in the Fertile Crescent, whose grain could be harvested in enormous quantities. People invented the tools to exploit that bounty: flint sickles, baskets, mortars and pestles, roasting techniques, and waterproof underground storage pits, and every one of those inventions was a step toward farming. Rising human populations demanded more food, and food production supplied it. In a self-reinforcing cycle Diamond calls autocatalytic. More food fed more people, who needed still more food. Finally, at the frontiers, the sheer numbers of food producers let them displace or absorb the hunter-gatherers around them. Where geography sealed hunter-gatherers off from farmers, in California, at the Cape of South Africa, in Australia, they survived into modern times, but only because they were confined to lands unfit for the crops of their neighbors. Chapter 7. How to make an almond. If all crops came from wild plants, how did poisonous or useless wild plants become food? Consider the almond. Most wild almonds contain a bitter chemical, amygdalin, that breaks down into cyanide. A handful can kill you. Yet occasionally, a single genetic mutation produces a non-bitter tree. In the wild, those sweet almonds are doomed, because birds eat all their seeds. But hungry, curious children of early farmers would have found and eaten the rare sweet ones, and those were the seeds that got planted. By 8,000 years before the Common Era, wild almonds appear at Greek sites. By around 1325, almonds were placed in the tomb of the Egyptian king Tutankhamun. This is domestication seen from the plant's point of view. Farmers, consciously or not, selected wild plants for larger size. Cultivated peas grew 10 times heavier than wild ones. Corn cobs grew from half an inch to over a foot. For sweetness instead of bitterness, for oily or fleshy or fibrous parts, and for seedlessness in bananas and grapes. They also selected, without ever noticing, for hidden traits, for wheat and barley stalks that did not shatter and scatter their seeds, for peas whose pods did not explode, and for seeds that germinated quickly instead of lying dormant. Some plants were easy to tame and some impossible. The reason oaks resisted domestication is instructive. Their acorns grow slowly, squirrels bury them everywhere beyond human control, and their bitterness is governed by many genes rather than one, so the offspring of a sweet oak are almost all bitter again. As Charles Darwin himself understood, opening on the origin of species not with finches, but with the artificial selection of gooseberries and pigeons, crop development is the visible model for natural selection. Chapter 8. Apples or Indians. Why did farming flower in the Fertile Crescent but barely develop in New Guinea or the eastern United States, and never at all in California or temperate Australia? Was the problem the people or the plants? Diamond's answer is unambiguous. It was the plants and animals, not the people. Of 200,000 wild flowering plant species, only a few thousand are edible, only a few hundred have been domesticated, and a mere dozen, wheat, corn, rice, barley, sorghum, soybean, potato, manioc, sweet potato, sugarcane, sugar beet, and banana, account for over 80% of all crops grown today. The Fertile Crescent won a botanical lottery. It has the world's largest zone of Mediterranean climate, which favors annual plants that pour their energy into big, edible seeds. Of the world's 56 largest seeded wild grasses, the cream of nature's crop, about 32 grow in the Mediterranean zone of Western Eurasia, while California and Southern Africa have one each and Southwestern Australia has none. Its wild wheat and barley were already so productive that they needed almost no genetic change to become crops, unlike New World corn, whose wild ancestor teosinte required thousands of years of transformation. The region also offered a high fraction of self-pollinating plants, convenient for early farmers, and 4 of the world's most important domestic mammals, goat, sheep, pig, and cow, living close at hand. Agriculture there rested on just 8 founder crops. By contrast, New Guinea's indigenous farming, though genuinely independent, lacked cereals and domestic animals. leaving highlanders so protein-starved that their children have swollen bellies, and cannibalism was widespread. In the eastern United States domesticated only a handful of small-seeded plants. Some, like the hay fever-causing, foul-smelling sumpweed, quietly abandoned once Mexican corn and beans finally arrived. Native Americans were not backward. Their local flora simply had less to offer. When a better crop reached them, they seized it eagerly. Chapter 9. Zebras, Unhappy Marriages, and the Anna Karenina Principle. Diamond turns Tolstoy's famous line inside out. Domesticable animals are all alike, but every undomesticable animal is undomesticable in its own way. To be domesticated, a wild species must clear many hurdles at once, and failing even one is fatal. Of the world's 148 big wildland mammals that were candidates, only 14 were ever domesticated before the 20th century, the ancient 14. Just 5 of them became major, worldwide livestock: the cow, sheep, goat, pig, and horse. And the wild ancestors of 13 of the 14, including all of the major 5, lived in Eurasia. Sub-Saharan Africa, despite its spectacular herds, domesticated not a single one of its native mammals. The Americas domesticated only the llama and its relative the alpaca. Note the crucial distinction between taming and domesticating. Hannibal's war elephants and Asia's work elephants are merely wild animals captured and tamed. A domesticated animal is one selectively bred in captivity and genetically reshaped for human use. Its breeding and feeding controlled. Many animals reach the first stage. People keep astonishing pets, from tamed cheetahs and hyenas to Ainu bear cubs, but only a handful ever emerge as true domesticates. Diamond names 6 ways a marriage between humans and a wild species can fail. The animal may be too inefficient to feed, like a carnivore, since it takes 10,000 pounds of plants to grow a 1,000-pound cow and 10 times that to grow 1,000 pounds of meat eater, or it may grow too slowly, like an elephant or gorilla that takes 15 years to mature. It may refuse to breed in captivity. One Mughal emperor of India kept a stable of 1,000 cheetahs, yet every one was caught wild, because the cheetah's days-long courtship chase no cage allows. And the Andean vicuña, whose wool is the finest of any animals, resists captivity for the same reason. It may have a nasty disposition: the grizzly bear, the African buffalo, the hippo, which kills more people in Africa than lions do, and the zebra, which bites and will not let go and injures more American zookeepers each year than tigers, and which the eccentric Lord Walter Rothschild once drove through London in a carriage just to prove it could be done, before its temper defeated the whole enterprise. It may panic and batter itself to death, like the gazelle, which can leap 30 feet and run 50 miles an hour, the most frequently hunted animal of the ancient Fertile Crescent, yet never once domesticated. Or it may lack the right social structure. The ideal domesticate lives in herds with a dominance hierarchy that humans can simply take over, and with overlapping ranges rather than fiercely defended breeding territories, which is exactly why sheep, goats, and cattle work, and why most deer and antelope, and North American bighorn sheep, do not. Reindeer are the rare deer that fit, and so alone among deer were tamed. The zebras and buffalo of Africa were never domesticated, not because Africans failed. Modern scientists with every advantage have also failed with eland, elk, and moose, but because the animals themselves, in Francis Galton's phrase, were destined to perpetual wildness. Chapter 10. Spacious Skies and Tilted Axis. Glance at a world map and one difference between the continents leaps out. The main axis of the Americas runs north to south, spanning 9,000 miles. So does Africa's. But the main axis of Eurasia runs east to west. That single geographic fact, Diamond argues, had enormous and sometimes tragic consequences because it governed how fast crops, animals, and ideas could spread. Places at the same latitude share the same day length, similar seasons, similar climate, and similar diseases. A crop bred for one spot will thrive thousands of miles due east or west, but will fail if moved even a short distance north or south into a different climate. So Fertile Crescent crops raced across the wide temperate band of Eurasia, reaching Egypt, Europe, and the Indus Valley within a couple of thousand years, at roughly 0.7 of a mile per year, and by the time of Christ, the same cereals grew from Ireland to Japan. A typical Roman meal was already a geographic mishmash of foods domesticated elsewhere. But along the north-south axis of Africa and the Americas, spread crawled or stopped altogether. The llama, guinea pig, and potato of the Andes never crossed the hot lowlands to reach Mexico, leaving Mesoamerica without any pack animal but the dog. Mexican corn took thousands of years to reach the eastern United States and needed new cold-hardy strains before it could flourish there. Fertile crescent crops halted at Ethiopia and could not cross 2,000 miles of tropics to South Africa's Mediterranean Cape, which stayed farmable only by hunter-gatherers until Europeans arrived by sea in 1652. The wheel and the alphabet spread across Eurasia, but never left the barriers of the Americas. The song, America the Beautiful, imagines amber waves of grain from sea to shining sea, but in truth, only Eurasia's spacious skies let such waves spread. Around the axes of the continents turn the fortunes of history. Chapter 11. Lethal Gift of Livestock. Far more Native Americans died in bed from Eurasian germs than on the battlefield from Eurasian weapons. To understand why, we have to see disease from the microbe's point of view. The unpleasant symptoms we call disease, the coughing, the sneezing, the diarrhea, the genital sores, are often clever evolutionary tricks that help a germ spread to its next victim. Killing the host is usually an accidental byproduct. Our own bodies fight back with fever and antibodies, and over generations, natural selection gives populations that survive an epidemic some genetic resistance. The crucial point is that the great killer epidemics, smallpox, measles, flu, tuberculosis, plague, cholera, are crowd diseases. They spread fast. They either kill or leave you immune, and they die out unless there is a large, dense population with a constant supply of new babies to infect. Measles, for instance, needs a population of about 500,000 to sustain itself. It burned through the tiny, isolated Faroe Islands in 1846, infecting almost the entire population of 7,700 within 3 months, and then vanished until reintroduced. The Black Death killed a quarter of Europe between 1346 and 1352. The influenza of 1918 killed 21 million. Such diseases could not exist among small bands of hunter-gatherers, who instead carried older, chronic infections. They arose only after farming created crowded villages and cities living amid their own sewage, and decisively, they evolved from the diseases of the very animals that farmers had domesticated. Measles is closely related to cattle rinderpest, smallpox to a pox of livestock, flu to a disease of pigs and ducks, whooping cough to a disease of pigs and dogs. Eurasia's many domestic animals gave it many lethal germs. The Americas, with almost no domestic animals, evolved almost none. So when the two worlds collided, the germ exchange was catastrophically one-sided. Smallpox arrived in Mexico in 1520 with a single infected slave and killed nearly half the Aztecs, including the Emperor Cuitlahuac. Mexico's population crashed from about 20 million to 1.6 million within a century. When Hernando de Soto marched through the American Southeast in 1540, he found the great towns of the Mississippi already emptied by epidemics that had raced ahead of any European, their people reduced to the mound sites archaeologists puzzle over today. In 1837, a steamboat carried smallpox up the Missouri to the Mandan tribe, and one Mandan village fell from 2,000 people to fewer than 40 within a few weeks. Across the Pacific, the same story repeated. Measles killed a quarter of all Fijians in 1875, and Hawaii's population fell from around 500,000 when Captain Cook arrived to 84,000 by 1853. Germs did not only serve Europeans, however. The tropical diseases of the Old World, malaria, yellow fever, cholera, were the great barrier that kept Europeans out of Africa and the New World tropics for centuries, and that nearly defeated the building of the Panama Canal. But in the Americas and Australia, Europe's sinister gift, born of its long intimacy with its livestock, did more to conquer than all its guns. Chapter 12. Blueprints and Borrowed Letters. Writing marched alongside germs and steel as an agent of conquest, because it let commands, maps, and the accumulated experience of the past travel far, accurately, and in detail. Yet writing was invented from scratch only a very few times in human history, beyond dispute just twice, by the Sumerians of Mesopotamia before 3,000 years before the Common Era, and by Native Americans in Mexico before 600. Egyptian and Chinese writing may also have been independent. Inventing writing from nothing is staggeringly hard. The first scribes had to figure out how to break the stream of speech into units and represent sounds with signs, with no model to copy. Sumerian writing grew out of clay accounting tokens and reached its great breakthrough with the rebus principle, using the sign for a pictured word to stand for a similar-sounding abstract word. Because inventing writing was so hard, almost every other writing system was either copied or merely inspired by an existing one, what Diamond calls blueprint copying versus idea diffusion. The alphabet arose only once, among Semitic speakers, and every alphabet on Earth descends from it, evolving through Phoenician, Greek, which added vowels, Etruscan, and Roman. A vivid case of idea diffusion is the Cherokee syllabary invented around 1820 by a Cherokee named Sequoyah, who could neither read nor write English but grasped the idea that marks could capture speech, and reinvented from scratch a system of 85 signs, some borrowed in shape from English letters, but with entirely new meanings. Early writing was restricted, ambiguous, and used mostly by a handful of palace scribes for the dullest of purposes. The earliest Sumerian tablets are overwhelmingly accounting records of sheep and grain. 90% of the tablets from the city of Uruk are clerical inventories. Mycenaean Greece's linear B was so ambiguous, one sign standing for several consonants at once, that it never rose beyond palace accounts of sheep and flax, and the Iliad and Odyssey were composed and preserved by non-literate bards for centuries. The oldest Chinese writing is religious divination scratched onto oracle bones. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss said writing's main early function was to facilitate the enslavement of other human beings. Only when the simpler alphabet arrived did writing become personal. The first surviving line of Greek alphabetic writing, scratched on a wine jug around 740 before the Common Era, promises a vase to the nimblest dancer. And writing arose only in societies with food production and centralized states. The Andes, West Africa, and the Mississippi Valley lacked it not because their people were incapable, but because they were too far in time and space from the few centers of invention, walled off by deserts, seas, and jungle. Chapter 13. Necessity's Mother. We imagine invention as the work of lonely geniuses answering an obvious need, necessity as the mother of invention. Diamond argues the reverse. Most inventions are the mother of necessity. They are made by tinkerers curious about materials, and only afterward find a use, and only later still come to feel indispensable. When Thomas Edison built the phonograph in 1877, he proposed uses like recording the last words of the dying and announcing the time. He thought reproducing music was a debasement of it. The motor car, the airplane, the transistor, all were solutions looking for problems. And no genius stood truly alone. James Watt improved an existing Newcomen engine, which improved a Savory engine, and Edison's light bulb followed dozens of earlier ones. History's broad pattern would look the same whether or not any particular inventor had been born. This matters enormously, because it dissolves the idea that some continents were populated by inventive peoples and others by stagnant ones. Whether a society adopts an invention depends on many factors: its economic advantage, its prestige, vested interests, and how easily its value can be seen. The perverse QWERTY keyboard, designed in 1873 to slow typists down so early machines would not jam, survives to this day purely by entrenchment. Receptivity to innovation varies wildly from society to society and from era to era. Medieval Islam and medieval China were far ahead of Europe before turning conservative, while within New Guinea one tribe eagerly buys sawmills and trucks, and its neighbor ignores a helicopter. Because so many independent factors govern innovation, over a large enough area some societies will always be innovating, which is why what matters is the size of the area, its head start on food production, and how easily technology can diffuse across it. Technology also feeds on itself. It is autocatalytic. Gutenberg's printing press succeeded where the mysterious printed Phaistos disk of 1700 years before the Common Era failed, because Europe could combine 6 mature technologies: paper, movable type, metallurgy, presses, inks, and alphabetic scripts, that the disk's maker lacked. Isolation, meanwhile, can even cause technology to be lost. Aboriginal Tasmanians, cut off for 10,000 years, ended up with the simplest material culture in the modern world, having lost fishing, bone tools, and the ability to make fire. Japan offers the most striking case of deliberate rejection. Firearms reached Japan in 1543, and within decades Japan produced more and better guns than any country on earth. But the samurai class despised the weapon that let peasants kill nobles. And over the next century the government throttled gun production until the country was nearly without them, a rejection it could afford only because it was a populous island, safe from gun-toting neighbors, until Commodore Perry's fleet arrived in 1853. With more people, more competing societies, and easier diffusion, Eurasia's early lead compounded into a commanding one, not through superior minds, but through geography. Chapter 14. From egalitarianism to kleptocracy. The last great gift of food production was the centralized state. Diamond begins with the Fayou, a band of some 400 New Guinea hunter-gatherers who normally live as scattered single families and gather only once or twice a year. When they do gather, murderers come face to face with their victims' kin, and the meetings seethe with barely contained violence. The Fayou had already dwindled from about 2,000 people, largely through Fayou killing Fayou, for want of any institution to resolve serious disputes. This is the human condition before the state, and Diamond sketches a ladder of societies of rising size and complexity. The band, a few dozen kin. The tribe, a few hundred, still egalitarian and led at most by an informal big man, whose position is earned, not inherited, and who lives in the same hut and wears the same clothes as everyone else. The chiefdom, thousands, with a hereditary chief who monopolizes force and information, collects tribute, and stands above a commoner class. And the state, tens of thousands or millions, with kings, bureaucracies, laws, armies, and often writing. The engine driving societies up this ladder is population size. The larger and denser a population, the more complex its organization must become. Large societies simply cannot function as bands, for 4 reasons. Strangers who are not kin will fall into cycles of revenge killing without a central authority to keep the peace. Communal decision-making becomes impossible beyond a few hundred people. Economies need central redistribution rather than one-to-one exchange, and dense populations lack the space to live as scattered self-sufficient bands. But centralization always opens the door to what Diamond bluntly calls kleptocracy, the transfer of wealth from commoners to an elite. The difference between a robber baron and a statesman is merely the ratio of tribute stolen to services rendered. To keep the public's support, elites everywhere resort to the same tools: disarming the populace and arming the elite, redistributing enough tribute to keep people happy, using their monopoly of force to keep the peace, a genuine benefit given that murder was in fact a leading cause of death in many tribal societies, and above all, constructing a religion or ideology that justifies the transfer of wealth and the authority of the ruler. The claim that centralized force keeps the peace is not sentimental. Anthropologists once idealized band societies as gentle, but longer studies showed murder to be a leading cause of death. Among New Guinea's Yao people, woman after woman, asked to name her husband, would list several successive husbands, each killed violently. Institutionalized religion did something else invaluable, too. It let unrelated strangers live together without killing each other, and it gave soldiers a motive beyond self-interest to die for the state. The patriotic and religious fervor that made Christian and Islamic conquerors and Aztec warriors chanting of the flowery death so dangerous, a willingness to die that would have been unthinkable in a band or tribe. States did not form, as Rousseau imagined, by peoples freely agreeing to merge. They formed under the threat of force or by outright conquest, as competition between societies drove ever larger and more centralized units, from the Cherokee Confederation to the Zulu Kingdom. Chapter 15. Yali's people, Australia and New Guinea. Now Diamond applies these lessons continent by continent, beginning with Yali's own region. Australia is the driest, smallest, flattest, most infertile, and most climatically unpredictable of the continents, and its aboriginal peoples entered modern times as hunter-gatherers without farming, metal, writing, or states, despite Australia holding some of the world's richest iron and aluminum deposits. This looks, to a racist eye, like a controlled experiment proving Aboriginal inferiority. It is nothing of the sort. Australia and New Guinea were settled together, over 40,000 years ago, by the same ancestral people who then diverged in wildly different environments. New Guinea, mountainous, drenched in rain, with young fertile soils, developed farming independently in its highlands by around 7,000 years before the Common Era, one of the world's few true cradles of agriculture, with drainage ditches and terraced gardens supporting dense populations. Yet even New Guinea remained backward by Eurasian standards, and the reasons are geographic, not racial. Its crops were low in protein. It had no domesticable large animals. Its farmable highland zone was small, and its population never exceeded 1 million, fragmented by brutal terrain into thousands of tiny societies speaking 1,000 of the world's 6,000 languages, far too small, and divided to develop writing or metallurgy. Australia faced even harsher limits. Its soils were the poorest on Earth, its climate ruled by unpredictable multi-year droughts, and its native flora offered almost nothing worth domesticating. Only 2 of the world's 56 great wild grasses, both near the bottom of the list. Aborigines adapted brilliantly with firestick farming, burning the land to boost game and plants, and some southeastern groups were even building fish canals and villages, edging toward food production. The failure of New Guinea's crops and pigs to spread to Australia was not obstinacy, but geography, filtered through the diluting chain of the Torres Strait Islands. And when Europeans finally created a literate industrial society in Australia, they did not invent it there. They imported every element: the crops, the livestock, the metallurgy, the guns, even the germs, from 10,000 years of Eurasian development. The society Aboriginal Australians created was the one their environment allowed. Chapter 16. How China Became Chinese. China today looks monolithic, a single people with a single writing system, unified politically since 221 years before the Common Era. But this apparent unity is astonishing and recent. North and South Chinese are genetically distinct, and China once held enormous diversity, still visible in its more than 130 minority languages belonging to 4 separate families. China became Chinese through a vast, ancient process of homogenization, driven by the same forces as everywhere else. North China and South China were among the world's earliest independent centers of food production, millet in the drier north, rice in the wetter south, by around 7,500 years before the Common Era. Food production led, as always, to dense populations, bronze, and then the world's earliest cast iron, cities, writing, and powerful states. From these advantages, the peoples and languages of the north spread south and then far beyond, replacing or absorbing others, culminating in the political unification under the Qin dynasty, whose first emperor even burned the historical books of rival states. China's geography, its lack of severe internal barriers, its long east-west rivers linked by canals, made this unification possible where Europe's rugged, fragmented terrain never allowed it. Chinese food production and technology then radiated outward, transforming tropical Southeast Asia, whose original inhabitants survive only as scattered relict groups of Negritos, and profoundly shaping Korea and Japan. From Thailand to, as we will see, Easter Island, the peoples of the Pacific became, in a sense, China's cousins. Chapter 17. Speedboat to Polynesia. One of the greatest population movements of the last 6,000 years was the Austronesian expansion, which carried a single-language family from its homeland on Taiwan across more than half the globe, from Madagascar off Africa to Easter Island in the Pacific. Both language and archaeology point to the same story. Farmers of ultimately South Chinese origin colonized Taiwan, then the Philippines and Indonesia, replacing the original hunter-gatherers so completely that little genetic or linguistic trace of them survives. Their advantages were the familiar package of food production, dense populations, superior tools, seafaring skill in double outrigger canoes, and epidemic diseases. But when this Austronesian steamroller reached New Guinea around 1,600 years before the Common Era, marked by beautiful decorated lapida pottery, it stalled. Here it meant not thinly scattered hunter-gatherers, but established food producers with dense populations, their own crops, polished stone tools, disease resistance, and seafaring traditions. The Austronesians could only settle small offshore islets as trading potters and cling to a narrow coastal strip. They transferred their language more than their genes and never penetrated the interior. The contrast is the chapter's great lesson. The same invaders swept away hunter-gatherers in Indonesia but bounced off farmers in New Guinea. From the New Guinea region, however, the Lapita people sailed on eastward into the empty Pacific, reaching Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga by 1200 years before the Common Era, and eventually Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand, becoming the Polynesians, direct descendants of those first potters, and completing humanity's exploration of the globe. Chapter 18. Hemispheres Colliding. Here Diamond returns to Ka'amarka and gathers the whole argument to answer why Europeans conquered the Americas rather than the reverse. By 1500, Eurasian societies held decisive advantages in every proximate factor. In food production, Eurasia had 13 big domestic mammals to the Americas 1, and protein-rich cereals sown by the handful and plowed by animals, against corn planted by hand. Those animals bred the crowd diseases that devastated the New World, which had almost none of its own to give back. Eurasia had steel weapons, horses, wind and water power, wheels, and ocean-going ships. The Americas had stone and wood tools, no draft animals, and wheels-only on toys. Eurasia had many literate, competing states. The Americas had two great empires, and writing confined to a corner of Mesoamerica. These differences were the end point of trajectories stretching back thousands of years, and Diamond traces them to four ultimate causes. Eurasia's longer head start on human settlement, its far richer suite of wild plants and especially animals for domestication, its easier east-west diffusion versus the Americas' fragmented, barrier-broken north-south geography, and its larger, better-connected populations. The first Eurasian attempt to reach the Americas, by the Norse, failed precisely because its source, Norway, was poor, its targets, Greenland and Newfoundland, were marginal, and its latitude too far north for its advantages to tell. Spain's attempt, from a rich populous base at a subtropical landfall in 1492, succeeded, and the result was the largest population replacement of the last 13,000 years, the native population reduced by up to 95%, largely by germs, and the Americas remade with peoples from every continent. The outcome was decided not in October of 1532, but in the 11,000 years before it. Chapter 19. How Africa Became Black. Africa holds 5 of the world's 6 great human groups and a quarter of its languages, and its prehistory is a puzzle solved by combining evidence from peoples, languages, crops, and archaeology. Long before European colonialism, Africa's own great population movements had already reshaped it. The clues are startling. The people of Madagascar, off the East African coast, speak an Austronesian language nearly identical to a tongue of distant Borneo, the single most astonishing fact of human geography, the legacy of a prehistoric voyage across the entire Indian Ocean. And the fragmented distributions of Africa's Pygmies and Khoisan peoples, together with cliques stranded in languages far to the north, reveal that both were once far more widespread before being engulfed. The engulfers were the Bantu. Linguistic reasoning, the same logic that locates the English language in northwestern Europe rather than in America, where most English speakers now live, pins the origin of the 500 Bantu languages to a tiny homeland in Cameroon and Nigeria, from which they spread across half a continent. The Bantu's advantage was food production. Every one of Africa's indigenous crops was domesticated north of the equator, and Africa's famous wild animals, zebra, buffalo, rhino, hippo, could never be domesticated. So farmers stemming from the north, eventually armed with iron smelted in African furnaces, swept southward in one of the swiftest colonizing advances of prehistory, absorbing or displacing the Pygmy and Khoisan hunter-gatherers, until they were halted at South Africa's Fish River, not by any enemy, but by climate, because their summer rain crops could not grow in the Cape's Mediterranean winter rain zone. That botanical accident is why Dutch settlers in 1652 met only sparse Khoisan herders at the Cape rather than dense Bantu farmers, with heavy consequences for South African history ever since. And Europe conquered Africa, rather than the reverse, for the same reasons it conquered the Americas. Guns, literacy, and organization all descended from a food production that Africa's smaller area, poorer domesticates, and north-south axis had delayed. As Diamond puts it, the different fates of Africa and Europe stem ultimately from differences in real estate. Epilogue. The future of human history as a science. So how would Diamond answer Yali? He would say that the striking differences between the histories of the continent's peoples were due not to any innate differences among the peoples, but to differences in their environments, and he would point to 4 sets of factors above all. First, continental differences in the wild plants and animals available to domesticate. Second, the differing rates of diffusion within continents, fastest along Eurasia's east-west axis. Third, the differing ease of diffusion between continents. And fourth, differences in area and total population, which govern how many potential inventors and competing societies a landmass holds. These are not matters of opinion. One may dispute whether New Guineans are smarter than Eurasians, but no one can deny that New Guinea has a smaller area and fewer domesticable animals than Eurasia. One deep puzzle remains within Eurasia. Why did Europe, not the far more advanced Fertile Crescent or China, end up dominating the modern world? The Fertile Crescent, Diamond argues, committed ecological suicide, stripping its own fragile woodlands until it became desert, and its power drifted irrevocably westward to lands with more robust, rainier environments. China's fate is subtler and more surprising. Medieval China led the world in technology, cast iron, the compass, gunpowder, paper, printing, and between 1405 and 1433, it sent 7 great treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean as far as East Africa, each fleet made of hundreds of ships up to 400 feet long, with total crews of up to 28,000, decades before Columbus's 3 tiny ships crossed the Atlantic. And then, after a single court power struggle between 2 factions, China simply stopped, dismantled the shipyards, and forbade ocean-going shipping. And because no shipyards remained, the decision became irreversible. It could do this because it was unified. One decision silenced the whole country, as one decision would later close China's schools for 5 years during the Cultural Revolution. Europe, by contrast, was chronically fragmented, 1,000 statelets in the 14th century, 500 around 1500, carved up by peninsulas, islands, and mountains into separate languages and governments. When Columbus was refused by the rulers of Anjou, Portugal, and 2 Spanish dukes, he found a 5th patron in the King and Queen of Spain. When one European state neglected cannon, or printing, or electric light, another seized it and forced the rest to follow or be left behind. Europe's disunity, born of its geography, was its engine. The lesson is that connectedness helps technology up to a point, but too much unity can freeze it. Technology may advance fastest at a moderate level of connectedness, which over the last 1,000 years favored fragmented Europe. Diamond grants that 2 kinds of wild card genuinely complicate this environmental account. The first is cultural idiosyncrasy, small, accidental features that lock in and then shape great outcomes. The QWERTY keyboard is his favorite example, adopted through a chain of trivial accidents in the 1880s, including a publicized typing contest in 1888, and never dislodged since. Nothing in any environment selected for it, yet it now governs how the whole world types. Why China developed a writing of thousands of homophone distinguishing signs, why India developed rigid castes, why Christianity and Islam became proselytizing engines of conquest, these 2 may be cultural wild cards. The second wild card is the individual. Had a truck braked 1 second later in 1930, or a briefcase bomb sat a few inches closer in 1944, Adolf Hitler would have died, and the 20th century might look very different. But no great man theory can explain history's broadest pattern. Alexander may have nudged the affairs of already literate, iron-equipped states, but he had nothing to do with why Western Eurasia had such states, while Australia still had stone-tool hunter-gatherers. Diamond closes by arguing that human history can and should be studied as a rigorous science, like astronomy, geology, or evolutionary biology, fields that also cannot run controlled experiments, but instead compare natural experiments across time and space. Broad patterns, over long spans, are explicable, even if the outcome of a single election or battle is not. The hand of history's course at 8,000 years before the Common Era, he writes, lies heavily upon us still. Who are the Japanese? In a chapter added to later editions, Diamond turns his framework on one of the most distinctive of modern nations, whose very origins are fiercely contested. The Japanese are biologically almost indistinguishable from other East Asians, especially Koreans, yet their language is a near isolate, related at most distantly to Korean, sharing only about 15% of basic vocabulary, suggesting the two split more than 5,000 years ago. That contradiction between apparently recent arrival and an apparently ancient language is what makes the puzzle so charged, tangled up with the mutual enmity of Japan and Korea and with the politically forbidden excavation of the imperial tombs. The archaeology reveals two decisive transformations. The first was the invention of pottery in Kyushu around 12,700 years ago, the oldest known pottery in the world, and astonishingly, made by hunter-gatherers rather than farmers, because Japan's environment was so rich in nuts, fish, and game that people could settle down without agriculture. This launched the Jomon culture, which endured with remarkable stability for 10,000 years, supporting some of the densest hunter-gatherer populations ever known, perhaps 250,000 people, with no farming, metal, or writing. The second transformation came suddenly around 400 years before the Common Era, when the Yayoi lifestyle, irrigated rice agriculture, and iron tools arrived from Korea. For thousands of years, poor Korean farmers had held no advantage over rich Jomon hunter-gatherers, until irrigated rice, cold-resistant strains, population pressure, and iron tools combined to tip the balance decisively. Japan's population then exploded by a factor of 70 in 700 years. The evidence of skeletons and genes indicates that the modern Japanese arose as a mixture, dominated by the Korean-derived Yayoi immigrants, with a smaller Jomon contribution preserved most strongly in the north and in the Ainu people. Diamond resolves the language paradox by noting that neither the ancient Jomon language of Kyushu nor the ancient Yayoi language of the Korean immigrants need have resembled the modern Ainu or Korean tongues we know. Japanese and Koreans, he concludes, are like twin brothers who shared their formative years, peoples joined by blood yet locked in enmity, whose common future depends on rediscovering those ancient bonds. Across all of these histories, from Ka-Marka to Kyushu, the same conclusion holds. The vast inequalities that Yali's question pointed to were not written into the peoples of the world. They were written into the land, the plants, the animals, and the maps, the accidents of geography and biology that gave some peoples a head start of thousands of years and left others, through no fault of their own, waiting at the starting line.